I'm Iftikhar Campbell. Welcome to The Big Questions. Today we're live from Heartlands Academy in Birmingham, so welcome everybody here to The Big Questions. The activities of Islamist extremism across the globe have killed many more Muslims than people from other faiths, as we saw yet again earlier this month when 80 worshippers were killed and 250 injured by an Islamist suicide bomber at the Sufi Muslim shrine Sewan Sharif in Pakistan. Well, last week, Pope Francis declared that Muslim terrorism does not exist, just as no one puts the blame on Christianity when Christians engage in violent or criminal activities. So neither should Islam be blamed for the crimes of Islamists. Do we misrepresent Islam? Morning, everyone. Salmi Koob. Who is guilty of misrepresenting Islam? Who does it?
Well, I think right now it's a bit of an industry. In fact, there was interesting research done by California University which says that apparently $206 million a year is spent just paying people to actually run these kinds of stories. But there's two issues here.
What kinds of stories?
One issue is...
What kinds of stories?
Saying negative things about Muslims. Now, the issue that you referred to, that was a reality. So the people who carry out those atrocities, it's their responsibility. And of course, it's right.
Can I stop you there? I was
it.
surprised you said you immediately started blaming the media in the West. Shouldn't you?
Because you're asking me a question.
Shouldn't you be saying the people who misrepresent Islam are the people who go and join ISIS and the man at Cage who said that Mwazi was a lovely young man. The people who slaughter the cartoonists, aren't they the people?
Actually interrupted me halfway through that very sentence. I was talking about that very issue when I just said that the people who carry out these kinds of atrocities, they are first, primarily and mainly responsible. So that, for me as a Muslim, is I feel passionate about. And here in Birmingham, we have organised protests against, as Muslim community, saying not in our name, and we reject these people who carry out this kind of violence. But the Pope has a point about saying that when violent activities occur, we shouldn't blame a whole religion. That was an atrocity that you talked about in Pakistan. My family's roots are in Pakistan. Of course, I feel strongly about what's happening there. But you would have mentioned, for example, that this very week, that hundreds of Muslims in Burma have been killed by Buddhists. Now, I wouldn't say it's all about Buddhism. Of course I wouldn't. There are people around the globe, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, millions of Muslims were killed. But I still would not blame Christianity. You know, a lot of those people would, the soldiers themselves may have claimed that faith. So I think it's wrong to blame a whole religion. Does it mean that all religions are progressive? No. But does it mean that all religions are reactionary? No. It's a spectrum. You will see extremists in all backgrounds, whether atheists or religion.
Sadia Hamid,
and it's important to make that distinction.
It is. Sadia Hamid, Council of Ex-Muslims in Britain. Is it important if people say they are doing it in the name of a faith?
Yes. So I do think we do need to start talking about some of the harmful elements of Islam. I mean, in the Quran, it does advocate violence. It does advocate rape, even. And by not addressing that, we're doing Muslims a disservice, really, because, you know, we do misrepresent Muslims, but Islam isn't misrepresented. There are some really, really violent, harmful passages within the Quran, and
you're talking about slavery and...
Yeah, absolutely, and sexual violence, domestic violence.
Yes, more in the Bible against women.
Christianity has
a study was done showing that actually it's 2-to-1 ratio of violent verses compared to violent Quran.
Sex slaves.
So
did Muhammad have sex slaves?
Yes, yes. So did his followers, and it's still advocated for today. I think it was last week or the week before. Dr. Jonathan Brown was talking about slavery within Islam. He was talking about how. They feed their slaves, they shelter their slaves.
We have sex trafficking in modern day. You know, we have evil things going on.
But we don't excuse it.
But again...
But we don't what?
We don't excuse it.
I think for Sadia to refer to the Quran without really knowing the Quran is unfair.
Well, that's not...
Sadia, I didn't interrupt you
Quran.
at all, so please let me finish my point. And that is, in the Quran, there are very clear verses which indicate, and of course talk about war and peace. It talks about marriage and relationship. In the life of the Prophet, it is not true that he had sex slaves. He had been married to many women. Most of his wives were divorcees, elderly people, And at that time, the society...
And a 9-year-old.
Hold on, Sadia, you're still disturbing. In those days, people were given protection in that way, in the patriarchal society that they lived in. Quran is very explicit about relationship. And also the Arabic word for violence, believe it or not, is unf. The Arabic word does not appear in the Quran even once. So when we confuse the verses of war, which of course appears in the Quran, against our notion of peace and justice or violence, it of course creates confusion. The problem is, did you know, more than 40%...
It requires interpretation, doesn't it?
The interpretation...
But who says that your interpretation is right and somebody else's interpretation is wrong?
I'm not saying mine is right, Nicky. I'm saying it's very simple. In Arabic language, you have common dictionary that you can pick up and understand. It's about common sense. This is a language that's very rich, and it's got a 14-year intellectual history. There is a tradition of interpretation. There is a science of it. So you cannot just willy-nilly interpret. You have to refer to the sayings of the Prophet, refer to the scholars of the past, contextualize it in the time you live, and most importantly, make it and back it up with science.
Do you want to come in here, Alison? Yeah.
If your God wants peace in the world and he gives you a book, I would expect that that book would say very, very explicitly, be peaceful.
Yes, it does.
Don't end
the Arabic word,
there shouldn't
the Arabic word
it shouldn't
Islam.
take any interpretation
But there is an issue.
to pick those bits out.
The point you raise is very important, Nicky, and that is, do we misrepresent? And we do, by giving the wrong understanding. So, for example, the word Islam means peace. The entire lifestyle of a Muslim is the one who submits to peace. Anything else is unacceptable.
I think we have to make a very important distinction between Islamist extremism and Muslim people in general. The two are very, very different. We need to focus on the extremists who, as you rightly said, have primarily targeted fellow Muslims who don't conform to their particular interpretation of Islam. With regard to whether atrocities and outrages should be labelled as Islamic or not, when it comes to the Crusades, it would be absurd to say that the Crusades had nothing to do with Christianity. Christianity was the motivation of those Crusades and those atrocities against the Muslim world. And likewise, a small minority, a very small minority of Muslims are misusing or abusing, or in some cases they would say, following the Quranic interpretations and exhortations and doing things in the name of Islam. And we should not deny we shouldn't deny the connection.
Let's separate the cultural here, because we're talking about Islam is not just one thing, is it? There are hundreds of thousands of different types of Islam, and all too often it's put in one box, and it's incredibly simplistic. I mean, Sadia, this ICM poll recently, that shocked people. A lot of things in it shocked people. The level of belief in the conspiracy theory of 9/11, and the Jews did it. And some people said it was a fairly creditable poll, but some of the results, 54% of Muslims, it said, thought homosexuality should be illegal. I mean, illegal.
Yeah.
But I would contend that that's not necessarily to do with Islam, it's to do with cultures within Islam.
Well, within
or
Islam,
cultures that practice Islam.
Within Islam, they don't
from
tolerate
less socially progressive societies, no?
They don't tolerate homosexuality within Islam. They don't. I mean, a lot of religions don't tolerate homosexuality, and I think because right from a very, very young age, you're being told that it's not acceptable within Islam, then they are going to grow up into adults thinking that it is an unacceptable lifestyle. Now, we do have, you know, as the Council of Ex-Muslims, we do have people that come to us who are homosexual, who have had to leave the faith because the entire community, their entire families have turned their back on them.
What about apostasy? Is that a big problem, the abandonment of faith?
Absolutely, and, you know, if Islam was so peaceful, we wouldn't have people coming to us telling us their lives were at risk. We wouldn't have honour killings, we wouldn't have honour crimes, we wouldn't have forced marriages. Those things still happen.
Salma, let's hear from Salma Yaqub on that. Is there a problem in Islam with apostasy?
I think there is a problem in all religions and in all belief systems when it comes to orthodoxy, who claims the mainstream and who claims the fringes. You talked about homosexuality.
Can you not leave other religions with less bother and threat than...
Because an exception is being made, and therefore it's important to contextualise. It's only very recent. I mean, Peter Thatcher, your whole life you've been campaigning for gay rights, and you were not in an Islamic country campaigning for gay rights. And we see Donald Trump using right-wing conservatism backed by the Christian churches in America attacking the progressive rights of gay and lesbian people. So this is not a uniquely Muslim cultural issue, and that's what I take exception
apostasy.
to. I'm not going to deny.
Peter, a second, then the audience. Peter.
And on this point, most Muslims get it fundamentally wrong. The Quran has no explicit condemnations of homosexuality, and it prescribes no punishments. That is based on an interpretation that leads Muslims, or some Muslims, or many Muslims, to condemn homosexuality. So if you believe in the Quran itself says, this is the complete word of Allah. It requires no interpretation and no addition. It's not in the Quran that homosexuality is explicitly wrong, and it prescribes no punishments. Therefore, Muslims have no Quranic authority to condemn LGBT people.
So the interesting thing here, you have the sacred texts, and maybe they are being interpreted by different people through their own cultural prism or cultural prison. Yeah, let's have some thoughts from the audience. Good morning.
Good morning, Nikki.
Apostasy, what are your thoughts on that?
Apostasy, well, again, there are many examples historically during the time of the Prophet where people did decide to leave the faith or perhaps say it wasn't part of them and lived in absolute harmony with the Muslims at that time. What I think is happening is...
But you can understand, can I ask you a question? Because obviously you've got some great knowledge on this and a great faith. You can understand somebody who is in the so-called Islamic State being fed the line from the Quran on apostates if they turn back, take hold of them and kill them wherever you find them. Now, you know, they might say that surah means what it says.
Again, that's been decontextualized. It's taken out of its historical essence.
Yeah.
What the
That's the problem, isn't it?
What the Islamic State and the Daesh are doing is taking Quranic interpretation in a literal sense and a puritanical sense. Arabic has many layers when you interpret Arabic. I work in counter-extremism here in Birmingham. I run an organisation called WARN where we tackle radicalisation and we provide the evidence to show where contextualization, decontextualization of the Quran can cause more damage. Yeah. What we are not seeing today is the fact that cultural infiltration within the faith has caused a huge amount of problems when it comes to interpretation and the actual expressions of faith as we are seeing it today. That needs to be removed. People need to go down and understand what is representative of the faith and what isn't.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. A couple more points, and Afshin, I'm going to come to you. David, I've got your card, and of course we'll be back with you, Salma and Ajmal, who's always wanting to take part, and there's 2 more debates for you, Ajmal, as well, so don't forget, we've got 2 good ones coming up. Yes, sir.
About the cultural issues, when you look at Islam, every part of the world you look at, obviously you have Muslims from all parts of the world, you have white, English, you have Muslims. So the thing is about the culture. Everywhere you go, you have people who take their... Islam is supposed to supersede culture, but people do it the other way around. Say you go to Africa, you go to Gambia, you go to Mali, you go to Senegal, you see Muslims who openly practice witchcraft and voodoo, things that obviously violate Islam. And then you go to Pakistan again, you see people who, Pakistan and some other areas in the Indo-Pak continent, you see people who practice honor killing and stuff. That is not Islamic. And we Muslims here, we're struggling to fight, to explain to our co-workers and other friends that these are not Islamic, these are cultural issues. So again, if you notice, every point that has been made here, Islam is not the problem. It is Muslims misrepresenting Islam. So it's one thing...
Action. Don't worry. Don't worry. I've got a list of people who want to talk. Don't worry. It's all going to happen. Afshin, that point actually leads us quite nicely onto this, because we're talking about specific cultural influences and how that influences how people practice a religion and maybe muddies the water. Look at countries like Iran or Turkey. They used to be secular countries, not in the irreligious sense of the word, but secular countries where people were very much... women used to go about, they didn't have to cover they weren't forced to cover their faces. Many people find that obscene and dehumanising. And they were very different societies from how they are now. Look at Turkey now, led by a man who's he's a creationist. He thinks that all creatures were created just as they appear now on the earth. He's clamping down on human rights. So if you talk about Iran, what went wrong?
I mean, to be honest, I'm personally tired of this dichotomy of culture versus authentic kind of interpretation. We've been talking about this for the last 10 minutes. Almost every single contributor talked about the importance and the significance of culture and the ways in which our cultural particularities determine our interpretive strategies. But not a single person talked about the importance of the political structure. I don't think the Muslim world right now requires a theological revolution. The Muslim world requires political reform. Because some of the ideas that we are talking about, I mean, we may waste actually many days and many weeks talk about narratives. This is the correct interpretation. That is a kind of incorrect interpretation. But this is irrelevant. The question that we need to ask is why in 2017, some of the ideas that even vast majority of Muslims regard as problematic, why they managed to find political agency, why they managed to be kind of effective, what paved the way for them to gain kind of this transformative kind of political authority. And of course, this is not about kind of competing perspectives. This is not about competing interpretations. It's about the prevailing political structure, which unfortunately unleashed these ideas. And I often actually compare this with anti-Semitism in Europe. Anti-Semitism, unfortunately, has been part and parcel of European history for a very long time. But you have seen kind of different manifestations of anti-Semitism in different historical phases.
Yeah.
Europe didn't all of a sudden become more anti-Semitic in, I don't know, in the 30s when we saw kind of the atrocities of the Holocaust. It wasn't a cultural problem, it was a political problem. The political machine which came to power in Germany in a way set the stage for those atrocities. And this is exactly what's happening right now.
So we're getting the political distortions.
So, and this is completely ignored, and we're wasting our time about, oh, this is a wrong interpretation and this is a correct interpretation, and we're not paying attention actually to the cause of the problem, and we are obsessively only looking at the symptoms of the problem.
Yeah. Excellent point. Right. Let me go, Christopher. Your book sounds absolutely fascinating, and you haven't paid me to say that. I mean, it really does. The author of the Islamic Enlightenment. When we look back, we see great scientists. We saw great scientists in Islam 1,000 years ago who predated Darwin's theory of evolution. When Darwin's theory of evolution came out, it was called by Charles Draper at the time the Mohammedan theory of evolution. This was the great art, fantastic, amazing sculptures and geometric art and actual art representation of people and of animals, which is frowned on now. The great mathematicians. Is this question legitimate? What went wrong?
It's a question that comes up again and again. It's a legitimate question, and I think I agree with Afshin that we have to look at the political and the historical reasons behind, and we shouldn't be obsessing about what ayah of the Quran says what. For the individual believer, that's important, but in the grander scheme of things, history is what counts. And what history tells us not only is that 1,000 years ago or 1,100 years ago in Baghdad and Persia and across the Middle East, there was a great efflorescence, a great upsurge of knowledge, and the contribution made by Islamic cultures to human knowledge, not Islamic knowledge, but human knowledge, is beyond question. But the other thing, that the great black hole in our historical understanding comes in the 19th century and the early 20th, which is when modern ideas entered the Middle East and were, to an extraordinary extent, absorbed and taken on board. We've discussed slavery this morning. Slavery disappeared within a matter of decades in the Middle East. This venerable old Islamic institution effectively disappeared. The segregation of men and women into entirely
1964, Saudi Arabia, slavery disappeared.
That is an aberration, and Saudi Arabia didn't even exist at the time that I'm talking about. This is before the existence of Saudi Arabia. No, the advances, political and otherwise, across the Middle East in the 19th century were immense. There were two revolutions, both of which no one knows about, these revolutions in the West. A revolution in Turkey and a revolution in Iran that brought in parliamentary systems of government. This is before the First World War. The first Turkish constitution, 1876. What went wrong? Well, to my mind, a lot of what went wrong is an external stimulus. And in 1882, the Brits invaded Egypt. Why did they invade Egypt? Because there was a very nasty-looking revolution going on there that would have meant that the British control and British influence over Egypt would have been greatly reduced. And so in 1914, all of this came to a head with the First World War, which obliterated the region physically. We don't talk about the number of dead across the Middle East in the First World War, but it was absolutely extraordinary, and it left behind famine and the complete obliteration of borders. After that, what happened was that Britain and France carved up the region, or part of the region, and then the other part of the region, in order to avoid being swallowed up colonially, found these very strong secularizing regimes that secularized...
Can I boil this down with you, as a sort of jumping point? So there's been a kind of stultification, and because of all these external geopolitical influences, the Islamic world has stopped generating and is merely kind of reacting. Would that be fair?
I think the default mode of catch-up and how do we react to things that are entering from the West...
Has taken over.
Has taken over. And yet at the same time there was a very strong sense that what comes in from the West doesn't necessarily mean it is Western or antithetical to Islamic culture. It is perfectly possible to argue that it is all the common heritage of humankind. And so technology entered, medicine entered, new attitudes towards knowledge entered, Darwinism. It was much easier to advocate Darwinism at the turn of the 20th century in Cairo than it is today. So something has seriously gone wrong, I agree. But I think we need to look to our 20th century for the reasons, and they're mostly political.
How interesting. Yeah. Salma, which country... So you're nodding all the way through that. It's a really interesting analysis, wasn't it? Which country do you believe, which Muslim-majority country, which is best, shows Islam at its best in the world?
I think that's a really difficult one, because I actually don't think that there is like an Islamic state, and nor do I actually think there should be an Islamic state. There are countries where people happen to be majority Muslim. If you were to ask me the same question, for example, which country in the world would you say is the best Christian country? You know, there might be majority Christian countries, but, you know, I wouldn't necessarily think about it like that. But what most people might not know...
You can say which country in the world is the best, secular country. You can easily say that, can't you? The country that's most religiously tolerant.
But, for example, you know, there's places like Indonesia, which are the most populous Muslim countries, but most people would associate with that. People think of Saudi Arabia. And actually, you know, coming to the politics, it is countries like Saudi Arabia who actually are propped up by our country and by the US. And they actually do export violent extremist interpretations of religion. And that has been used as a political way to control their own population, as well as legitimise their actual existence. So there is a dangerous mix of politics and theology in countries like Saudi Arabia, which I totally accept, and I'm totally
Can I ask you another question before the end? I'd like to ask you, which is the... It just occurred. Which
but let me just say, you know, in Bosnia,
quickly,
that was a majority Muslim country. Now, people don't even know in Europe there was a majority Muslim country. People lived side by side with their Christian neighbours. This has been going on for 5 centuries, 500 years. Native people had converted. And then we saw Milosevic in the 1990s, who carried out a Christian crusade. But even now, I would still say we shouldn't blame Christianity. But they revived that kind of us and them mentality. In the 1990s, we saw a genocide of Muslims in the heart of Europe. So these are important political issues. And most of the conflicts in the world, when it's Palestine, Israel, it's either about land or resource, and people use the excuse of identity politics in the guise of religion to carry out those atrocities.
And a last question, if I may, and a quick thought and a quick answer. Which is the best country in the world today to be a Muslim?
I would say UK, England.
There we are. England, or Scotland, or Wales. Let's go. Now.